What I'm going to do now is give a really quick overview of American Indian history in the 20th century, particularly as regards resources. Now, this is probably going to take about half an hour, I'm guessing. If this were one of my American Indian Studies classes, this section could easily take 3 weeks or longer. But I'm just going to kind of give the simple explanations and kind of hit the high points. Now, I'm going to start in 1908 with another important Supreme Court decision, Winters versus United States, and it had to do with water, and particularly with these two tribes, the Assiniboine, alias the Nakota, and the Gros Ventre, who were in 1888 put on the reservation known as Fort Belknap after signing a treaty. And then after that, over the next 20 years, this reservation, as you can see, it's there in northern Montana. More and more settlers moved into the area in the late 19th century, all around Fort Belknap, and they started using the water. Remember all those discussions we had about the California Doctrine and the Colorado Doctrine and all that stuff? Well, they started using the water, diverting the water from the river for irrigation, diverting it, damming it to create reservoirs, and the effect this was having on the Fort Belknap reservation was that it was impacting the amount of water they were able to get. And this was brought to the court, and when it came to the Supreme Court, the ruling was in favor of the Indians because the explanation was that when they signed a treaty telling them that they had to live on this reservation, it was implied in the treaty that it would be possible for them to live, and water is necessary for it to be possible for them to live. And this treaty, like all treaties, was signed by Congress. And according to the Constitution, Congress alone has the authority to have treaties and commerce with Indian tribes. And what that means, then, is anything done by Congress supersedes state law, local law, anything like that where Indians are concerned. And the signing of the treaty guaranteed them water without explicitly saying it guaranteed them water. So the principle that arose from this case is called Winters' rights, water rights, essentially. So you cannot, regardless of whether we're talking California Doctrine, Colorado Doctrine, whatever it is, you cannot interfere with the water supply to a reservation. That's just that's sacrosanct, and that still remains the case today. Now, tribes can sign away their Winters' rights, and sometimes state and federal government agencies and officers try to get them to do that. If they do that, and very few of them do, they're screwed because they're no longer guaranteed those rights, and they're aware of it, which is why not that often that any of them can be cajoled into signing documents like that. All right. Well, World War I was an important moment for Native Americans. About 12,000 American Indian men served in uniform during the war, including Choctaws and others who were code talkers. You're probably familiar with the World War II Navajo code talkers, but the Choctaws did it first in World War I. Now, they were not put in segregated units. They served alongside the other soldiers. Now, the black soldiers were segregated, but the Native Americans were not. So lots of people who served in the military got to meet Indians and see that they still existed and that they were real people. And so many of them served proportionally that an act was passed in Congress in 1919 giving all Native American combat veterans American citizenship. But wait, you may say to yourself, they're Native Americans. Weren't they already citizens? No, they were not. But wait, you might say, what about the 14th Amendment post-Civil War, which stated that anyone born in the United States is a citizen? Didn't apply to Indians because they were viewed as citizens already of their tribe. Okay? So it wasn't until 1919 that veterans were made citizens, and then, when it was brought to the public's attention that Indians weren't even citizens, there was kind of a public outcry and a public cry of support for natives. And in 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, making all Native Americans American citizens, without requiring them to give up their rights as members of their own tribe. Now, this is nice, but it didn't necessarily mean that they had full rights, because those rights were abridged in various ways, especially voting rights. Voting was suppressed in many states out west and in Alaska for a long time. All right, well, remember the Dawes Act had come along and had, among other things, besides just allotting the land and dividing it all up, had banned certain things like Native American traditional dress or Native American religion. This started to swing the opposite direction when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president in 1932 and took office in 1933. Now, Roosevelt was elected, as you know, on the promise of a new deal for the American people, a better deal. Well, his policies toward American Indians came to be called the Indian New Deal, and his Commissioner of Indian Affairs played a large role in that. His name was John Collier. That's him on the bottom. He was FDR's Commissioner of Indian Affairs for the entire time that Roosevelt was in office, which was 12 years. And under Collier, things were changed, and even in Congress. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 was passed, reversing the Dawes Act. So by reversing it, that meant that no longer did the land have to be allotted. Tribal governments were no longer banned. Tribes were allowed to have their own governments again, have their own sovereignty and self-government up to a point. Now, it still wasn't perfect because, for one thing, the U.S. government picked who the chief would be. So that's not perfect. But they did get authority, the tribes did, over how to manage their resources, again, up to a point. And they were able to establish health and education services, including teaching tribal culture to their children, which for a couple of generations, children had been prevented from learning their own culture or their own language. Most of the restrictions on native rituals were lifted, though not all. There were still some. But this was a big step in the right direction, at least. Now, World War I was important. World War II was even more important because more Native Americans served, and they not only met soldiers from other walks of American life, they also, and this is an important thing, they met other Indians from other tribes in other parts of the country and learned that, they had a lot of problems in common and started to develop a social network. This led to two things. For one thing, the powwow culture. Every once in a while, there will be a powwow near Cookeville, Tennessee. I encourage you to go. You're always welcomed to go. It's like the county fair. A lot of people come together. A lot of vendors are there, a lot of food vendors, and there are dance competitions, and it is a lot of fun. That was illegal during the Dawes period. Well, now it's no longer illegal, so they can have these parties, but so many people had met so many other people from around the country that there developed what's known as the powwow circuit, which entertainers and performers and competitors would travel around the country to go to a bunch of different powwows, and some people would go just to attend them, not even to compete. So that's one thing. And another thing was Pan-Indianism and political activism, Pan-Indianism, working together despite tribal differences for Native American issues, particularly in trying to get legislation passed to benefit American Indians. Now, one of the things that came about because of this during World War II was the formation of the National Congress of American Indians, which is a group that has representatives from hundreds of tribes and still exists and is very active. After World War II, however, the pendulum swung back the other direction once again. This was known as the termination period. Now, it's not extermination. This doesn't mean terminating the lives of American Indians. But after 12 years of Roosevelt, followed by Truman, 1946, there was a big swing the other direction politically, and conservative Republicans got a supermajority in Congress, and that's when things started to change. They started to call for the termination of special relationships between Indian tribes and the U.S. government. Now, the way it was framed sounded positive. We don't want Indians to be, to be backward. We don't want Indians to be dependent. We want them to become fully active American citizens in American life and become American. Does that sound disturbingly like the whole Dawes Act thing? Because it was. The goal here was to, just like with the Dawes Act, disincorporate tribal governments and terminate the tribe so they no longer had federal recognition as a tribe, no longer be recognized as sovereign, which meant the treaty obligations the U.S. had would no longer exist. So in other words, there is no more tribe so far as a government, and you're on your own. So now you're just an American like the rest of us. This led to a lot of Native Americans whose tribes did get terminated moving to the cities. This was the rise of the urban Indian. Cities like Los Angeles and Phoenix and Minneapolis. Minneapolis was sort of like urban Indian central. Some tribes got terminated and some didn't. The ones that didn't tended to be the larger tribes who had the resources to fight this stuff in court long enough for the political winds to change. Some of the tribes that were terminated were later restored to federally recognized status, but many of them were not, which means the U.S. has no treaty obligations to them anymore. During that time period, by the way, the Supreme Court was the one branch of government of the three that was most likely to side with Indians on things in the 1950s. Now, 1960s, you got the civil rights movement going strong, and you've got Indian civil rights activists. You've got groups like the National Congress of American Indians, for example, still being very active. Tribal recognition started to be restored. Termination started to be slowed down. First under Kennedy, then under Lyndon Johnson, and finally the whole termination policy was ended under Richard Nixon. Now this is weird, probably, but two of the best friends in the White House that American Indians have ever had were Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. The Voting Rights Act of 1964, speaking of Lyndon Johnson, that was his brainchild and dream project. You've heard of it. It was designed to make sure African Americans in the South were able to exercise their voting rights because they were prevented from doing so frequently. Most people don't know that that act applied also to American Indians in the western states and Alaska. 1968, you had the Indian the Indian Civil Rights Act, which basically guaranteed that if you are a Native American living on a reservation, all the rights that are in the Bill of Rights in the first 10 amendments apply to you on the reservation through your tribal government as well as the federal government. For example, tribal governments can't decide they don't like you having a newspaper and banning your newspaper. They can't prevent you from freedom of speech. The only thing that was not a part of that was the part there about not establishing a religion, because the tribes do have as their official religion their tribal religion, and that was deemed to be okay. Well, a lot of, like I said, a lot of Native American activists were getting involved in trying to make political change, and it was very similar to what was going on with the Black Freedom Movement. You had the Civil Rights Movement in the mid-50s to the mid-60s, but then you had that shift toward Black Power in the mid to late 1960s. And those Black Power activists believed that the older civil rights leaders were too accommodating and that they compromised too much. And so they started making stronger demands more forcefully. Same thing happened with Indian activists. And this was the rise of Red Power. Really got started in I think you could say in 1968 with the American Indian Movement, which we're about to talk about. But this is what really brought it to the public's attention. What happened in Alcatraz, beginning in 1969. Now, Alcatraz, you probably heard of. It was a prison on an island off the coast of California, San Francisco Bay. A prison that no one ever escaped from except Clint Eastwood in that one movie. In the mid-60s, however, Alcatraz, a federal prison, was closed down because a new prison was being built on the mainland. So all the personnel who worked at Alcatraz were recalled to the mainland to go work at the new prison, and the government kind of left the old prison empty while they were trying to figure out what to do with it. Well, a group of young Native Americans, many of them college students, got in a boat one night and sailed out to Alcatraz Island and said, "Hey, look at us. We just discovered an island," and they planted a flag on it. They called themselves Indians of all nations. Now, it turns out that there was a treaty in 1868 that said any federal fort or other federal building abandoned by the federal government could be claimed by Indians. So, bingo, there they were to claim it. Now, federal government didn't look at it that way, so they actually had a big standoff. Now, lots of other Indians came, and some allies, some non-native allies, got out there, brought food and supplies and stuff, and they had kind of a standoff, a siege that lasted for months and months, that very gradually finally started to die out when their electricity was cut off and they were running out of food. Nonetheless, this was on the news. This was on the news for a while, every night. And Americans got to see, hey, there are still Indians, and look, they've got these very specific problems. And it gained some sympathy. One of the things also that they did was proclaim Unthanksgiving Day. Not really pleased with the whole, arrival of Europeans on their shores. The other thing to talk about with Red Power is, as I mentioned, the American Indian Movement that was founded by several Ojibwe Indians in Minneapolis in 1968. One of the co-founders was Dennis Banks, that's him on the right, as well as the Belcourt brothers and others. Russell Means became, along with Dennis Banks, the most well-known of the leaders of the movement. He wasn't one of the founders. He joined them shortly after, and he was not Ojibwe. He was Lakota Sioux, originally from Pine Ridge. His family was from Pine Ridge Reservation. So the American Indian movement modeled themselves on the Black Panthers, and they did high-profile things to attract attention to their cause. Like, for example, they went to Plymouth, Massachusetts on Thanksgiving and occupied the replica of the Mayflower. They occupied Mount Rushmore. They occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs main offices in Washington, D.C. And then the really big thing came when they occupied Wounded Knee. Now, Wounded Knee, haven't talked about in here. Hopefully you've heard of it. That's where in 1890, hundreds of Sioux, Lakota, were slaughtered by the U.S. Army with virtually no opportunity to fight back, buried in a big mass grave. 84 years later, mid-1970s, there was an issue there on the Rosebud and Pine Ridge reservations and the Standing Rock reservation as well, where Native Americans were being beaten by police when they left the reservation, or beaten by civilians, white civilians, who never seemed to have anything done to them as a result. And so Means and Banks were there to protest the murder of a young Native American man at the courthouse in the neighboring town of Custer, of all places, that broke into a riot and then sort of fell back to Wounded Knee and occupied the compound that was a general store and various other buildings owned by non-Indians. Non-Indians whose family had bought it as a result of the Dawes Act decades before. So they had a big standoff. There were a large number of American Indian Movement members from around the country, from all different tribes, that were there in this big standoff, this months-long standoff against the FBI and federal marshals. And several people were shot. A handful of people were killed. But again, this was something that was on the news every night and caused, a growing sympathy among a lot of Americans for the cause of these American Indians. I believe that the Red Power movement and the attention that they attracted and the sympathy that they attracted led to political action. Now, Native Americans are a very small percentage of the American population, small percentage of voters. In some states, they're a high enough minority that they can affect how things turn out. But overall, not so much nationally. But if they get support and people who sympathize with them put pressure on their congressman, then it translates into positive things happening. And that's what happened in the 1970s. There was a period there in the 1970s under Nixon when co-management became the word of the day, sort of in between termination on one extreme and total sovereignty, which the nations of the Indian nations do not have because Congress refuses to recognize that they do, and Congress has plenary power. So in between, in this sense, the tribal governments and the federal government share responsibility. And this is even true. Remember I said earlier when we were talking about parks that in some parks, Native Americans get more of a say than they used to. Those are the smaller parks, but not the big ones, not the ones that are considered crown jewels. But some of the things that came about, some of the changes that happened, included that now tribal councils get to decide how to use the money that the federal government allocates for their tribe. And by the way, that's not welfare. That is treaty obligations that were made a long time ago. But the tribal councils get to decide how to use it. So if there's a school to be built, back even under the Indian New Deal, the federal government would just build a school and say, hey, you guys need a school. Now the tribal government gets the money and gets to take bids and use whatever contractors they decide that they would like to use in whatever way they want to. And they're able to manage their own natural resources on their reservations. So, at this time, there are 310 reservations comprising 6.3 million acres of commercial forest, 43 million acres of rangeland, 3 million acres of farmland, and here's a big one, 20% of U.S. oil and gas reserves, and 33%, roughly one-third, of the West's coal reserves, and half of all uranium reserves. Now, when treaties guaranteed them the reservations that they were on, back in the 1800s, no one even knew what uranium was. No one knew that there was coal there, and oil and gas was not something that was used. So this is something that over time turned out to be a big benefit to the tribes. Or was it a benefit? It can sometimes be arguable. Now, uranium, there's a lot of uranium in New Mexico and Arizona on the Navajo reservation. And in the 1940s and 50s, private companies were basically employed by or allowed by the federal government to come in because of national security, because uranium is important, to come in and open up uranium mines. And they used Navajo workers. And the conditions were terrible. There are interviews with Navajos who worked at that time who will tell you that they weren't allowed to have bathroom breaks. They weren't allowed to leave the mines to go to the bathroom. So they had to just use the bathroom in the mine where they were working, and they didn't have toilet paper. So they used uranium ore to wipe themselves. And within a short time, that little area on the Navajo reservation had the highest concentration of colon cancer in the United States. They also weren't allowed, they didn't have water coolers or anything. They drank the water in the mines, also irradiated by uranium. And the death rate of the Navajos from cancer was just outrageous. Finally, in 1990, the United States government compensated survivors $100,000 apiece, but that doesn't even cover the hospital bills that they would have had, let alone the long-term effects of the uranium on the water supply and in the soil, which is still a big issue today. In the year 2020, as I am recording this, one of the big problems on those reservations in the Southwest is how to get rid of all the uranium that has leaked into their water supply. Well, one big problem that reservations have faced has been, since they've gotten control of their own on-site reservation resources, the fact that companies will come in, mining companies especially, coal mining companies frequently, and set up operations right outside the border of the reservation. And the pollution that is created, like for example the runoff, affects the reservation, even though it's not on the reservation. In 1994, under President Clinton, a law was passed that all federal agencies have to carefully consider effects of any policy on Indian land and coordinate with tribes. All this talk about uranium and cancer has got me coughing my lungs up here. All right, well, another important resource, particularly for Indians in the Pacific Northwest, is fish. Now, other areas as well, fish are important, but especially there in Washington and Oregon and Northern California, where those tribes traditionally gain their living from fishing. An important Supreme Court case came up in 1905 called U.S. versus Winans. which stated, this is the ruling, a ruling in favor of the Indians, that taking fish at, well, let me just explain the situation. The treaty that the Puyallup and other Northwest Pacific tribes had signed stated that they could fish at all the usual and accustomed places, kind of similar to those treaties about hunting in the usual and accustomed places, unless it turns out it becomes a national park, right? So some of these, well, when we talked about this stuff with the Bannocks and with the Blackfeet, the area that they wanted to hunt was considered public property owned by the government. The question arose, what if the area where they traditionally did their fishing was now private property, but the treaties stipulated they could still fish in the usual and accustomed places? The court in Winans took the side of the Indians and said they have the right to set up fishing operations even on other people's private property if it is part of their traditional fishing ground. Now, the state of Washington continued, and continues really, to try to curtail the fishing rights of the Indians of that state and force them to conform to state law. 1942, the Supreme Court ruled that Washington cannot force Indians to buy fishing licenses to fish on the reservation or on usual and accustomed places. There were several cases in the 70s with the Puyallup tribes in which the state tried to ban net fishing, and we've touched on this before when we were talking about salmon in the Pacific Northwest. Net fishing has been banned for a long time because it takes too many fish, but it's the way the Puyallup had traditionally fished, so they get a pass on that. 1974, United States versus Washington, it was established that Indians have the right not just to be able to live, but to make a living. And so if traditionally they had made their living as a tribe by fishing, they have to be allowed still to do that. Therefore, any area that's part of their traditional fishing area, Indians have the right to harvest, or have the right to up to 50% of the potential fish harvest. Now, this is where you have fish and wildlife people whose job it is to do the calculations to figure out what the potential harvest is and what that translates into. But that means that they don't just have the right to take enough fish to feed themselves. They have the right to take enough to sell and make a modest living. Now, throughout the last several decades, starting in the 1960s, a lot of this stuff was going on in the Pacific Northwest that that led to a lot of demonstrations by Native Americans, fish-ins instead of sit-ins, and particularly Marlon Brando, who really sympathized with the Indians quite a bit, went up there and protested with them, got arrested a few times. And they have continued to make, well, thanks to the Supreme Court, they've been able to continue to maintain their traditional rights. And this brings us now to a fishing dispute that does not involve the Pacific Northwest, as I hinted that there are such things. And this dispute took place in Minnesota. The Mille-Lac Band of Chippewa Indians, their official name. Chippewa is the same thing as Ojibwe. It was just an American mispronunciation. Ojibwe, Chippewa, that's how that happened. Anyway, Minnesota argued that the 1837 treaty with the Mille-Lac Band of Chippewa that gave them the right to fish in the usual and accustomed places was invalidated when Minnesota became a state. Now, that's the same argument that Wyoming gave in U.S. versus Racehorse, which was used as precedent in a lot of cases down over the following century. But not this time. 1999, the court sided with the Ojibwe, and the majority opinion was written by Sandra Day O'Connor, and that effectively overturned U.S. versus racehorse. So no one can effectively use that argument anymore, although in recent years Wyoming has tried to use that same argument again, but the court wouldn't hear it because now there's this new precedent. Okay, well, talking about Native American resources, have to mention now that we are in the year 2020, that the previous presidential administration, the administration of Donald Trump, has been a real low point for Native American rights in general, and especially for the protection of Native American resources for several reasons. And I list some of those reasons here, beyond just insulting and demeaning references to Indians. Rolling back the National Environmental Policy Act, which was an act that gives the public time to research and make comments on environmental issues before they are pushed through. That is a blow against Native Americans trying to protect their resources, as well as environmental resources around the country in general. Now, another thing that the Trump administration has been doing is trying really hard to be able to open the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, to open it up to oil drilling. Now, Bush wanted to do this as well, but it didn't get done. What this would mean, if that were allowed, is that not only would the ecology in general be sort of disrupted, but in particular, the caribou herds would be impacted. And several of the tribes, the Gwich'in, some of the Inuit tribes, live on the caribou the way that the Pacific Northwest tribes live on salmon. So that would be catastrophic for them. Another thing has been green-lighting various oil pipeline projects that Native American nations have protested, including the one at Standing Rock that we'll be talking about in detail in a little bit. And then also these two national monuments, particularly the Bears Ears Monument that was established as a national monument in the year 2016, the last year of Obama's administration. Both Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante are in Utah, and it was petitioned by several tribes in the area to get these made into national monuments. The following year, after Trump took over, he, by executive order, reduced Bears Ears National Monument by 85% and Grand Staircase Escalante by 50%, in order to open that land up to oil and gas developers. Now, those various tribes, including the Ute, Navajo, Hopi, Zuni Pueblo, and others, have sued the federal government claiming that the president doesn't have the unilateral authority to cancel out an act of Congress making a national monument. So I guess we'll see. Now, one other thing to mention is something that happened also near the end of Obama's administration into the beginning of Trump's, and that was the death of Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia in February 2016, which was, as you are probably aware, the Republican majority in the U.S. Senate, led by Mitch McConnell, would not allow Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, to have a hearing, let alone a vote to be approved. And they left that seat open for a year almost, until after the election when Trump won. And then his pick, Neil Gorsuch, was immediately approved, to the consternation of progressives around the country. Now, what does that have to do with Native Americans? I can tell you, and it's kind of an unexpected thing. Scalia was one of the worst enemies that American Indians had in the Supreme Court in a long time, because he was very much a states' rights guy, and he would almost always side with the states against Native American tribes on most issues. Now, one unexpected development with Gorsuch, despite the fact that he's extremely conservative, which is why Trump wanted him, is that before he was on the Supreme Court, he had a long history of supporting Native American issues, especially related to sovereignty. And despite all the other things in which he's voted, probably the way Scalia would have, he has tended to vote in favor of American Indians since he's been in office, including a really important case that was finally decided in 2020, in which, remember that Dawes Act stuff we talked about earlier? Turns out that when the 5 civilized tribes were discorporated by the government, they weren't actually discorporated by the government because Congress forgot to vote on it. So therefore, the Supreme Court has ruled just recently that the entire eastern half of the state of Oklahoma is still an Indian reservation, and it remains to be seen what the consequences of that are going to be. All right, one other thing that I had mentioned was the pipeline issue. I had planned to save talking about that until the end of the course because it's so recent, but it really fits in well with what we're already talking about. So next I'm going to go into a little more detail about the pipeline issues.